Officer Jonathan sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the busy streets of the city. It had been a grueling morning, one filled with back-to-back calls, each more frustrating than the last. His patience was wearing thin, and the weight of his badge seemed heavier than usual. His mind was cluttered with frustration, not just from the day's events, but from a deeper sense of unrest that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Back in the day, people respected the badge, he muttered under his breath, glancing at the pedestrians on the sidewalk, some walking by with indifferent looks or even glares. Now, everyone thinks they know how to do my job better than me. Jonathan had served over 20 years as a police officer, and he had always taken pride in his work. But recently something had shifted. It wasn't just the rising tensions between police and the communities they served. It was something internal, a feeling of being out of step with the world. As he rubbed his tired eyes, he thought about how he had gotten here, dedicating his life to protecting people, but now feeling like a stranger in the very streets he once patrolled confidently. As Jonathan drove through the city, his thoughts wandered to how much had changed. The streets seemed busier, the faces more distant. He couldn't shake the feeling that the city, once a place of order, was slipping into chaos. He recalled the days when he felt connected to the people he served, when his presence on the street brought comfort rather than suspicion. Now it seemed like every glance in his direction was filled with distrust. The world's moving too fast, he thought, feeling increasingly out of place in the shifting social landscape. Discussions about police reform, systemic bias, and racial injustice dominated the news, and Jonathan found himself bristling against these conversations. Though he had sat through countless trainings on bias and sensitivity, the message felt abstract to him. In his mind, he was just doing his job, following the law, maintaining order. Yet there was a small, persistent voice in the back of his mind that questioned his own stance. Had he become too rigid, too defensive of the badge to see what others were trying to tell him? He quickly pushed the thought aside. I treat everyone the same, he insisted to himself, fair and square. As Jonathan turned onto the next street, he felt his jaw clench instinctively. He was entering a predominantly black neighborhood, an area that always put him on edge. Though he couldn't quite pinpoint why, this part of town made him uneasy. His patrols here always felt different, like there was a wall between him and the community, even when nothing was visibly wrong. He scanned the streets with narrowed eyes, his gaze darting between the people walking along the sidewalks. He noticed a group of young men laughing and talking on the corner. Immediately, his hand moved to rest near his holster. They're probably up to no good, he thought automatically. It was an assumption that came too easily, and he felt a twinge of guilt as it crossed his mind. Jonathan had been trained to avoid such biases, but deep down he recognized how ingrained they had become. He had patrolled this neighborhood for years, and he had seen his fair share of trouble here. Still, part of him knew it wasn't fair to assume the worst about everyone he saw. But old habits, especially those shaped by years on the force, were hard to break. As he continued driving, he spotted something that made him slow down. A little black girl, sitting alone near the curb of a park, playing quietly with a worn-out doll. As Officer Jonathan continued driving through the neighborhood, he caught sight of something unusual. A small girl, no more than 5 years old, was sitting alone on the curb near a park, her tiny hands clutching a worn-out doll. She was quietly playing, lost in her own world, seemingly unaware of her surroundings. Jonathan's eyes narrowed as he slowed down his patrol car. What's a kid doing out here all alone? He muttered to himself, immediately feeling a sense of unease. His thoughts raced. The neighborhood was known for its troubles, at least that's how Jonathan saw it. He had dealt with enough calls here to know things weren't always what they seemed. The sight of this young girl stirred something inside him, a deep-rooted suspicion that was hard to shake. Where are her parents? He thought, his mind jumping to conclusions. His years of experience had taught him to be cautious, but they had also ingrained a bias, one that whispered in his mind that this was just another example of negligence. Without a second thought, Jonathan pulled the car over, his frustration from the morning adding to the edge in his actions. This didn't feel right, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. Jonathan stepped out of his patrol car with purposeful strides, his boots hitting the pavement heavily as he made his way toward the little girl. His face was set in a stern expression, and his voice rang out sharp and authoritative, breaking the peaceful quiet of the park. "Hey, you!" he called out, causing Mia to look up, startled. Her wide, innocent brown eyes met his, filled with confusion and fear. She clutched her doll tighter to her chest, as if seeking comfort from it. "Where are your parents? You shouldn't be out here alone," Jonathan demanded, his tone harsh, as if speaking to a criminal rather than a child. Mia tried to speak, her voice trembling with fear, but the words caught in her throat. Tears welled up in her eyes, her lower lip quivering. The sight of her distress didn't soften Jonathan's approach. Instead, it only made him more impatient. "I asked you a question," he snapped, stepping closer, towering over her small frame. "What's your name? Where do you live?" Mia whimpered, too frightened to respond. Jonathan, in his frustration, ignored the growing fear in the child's eyes. His mind was racing, assumptions piling on top of one another. This was exactly what he expected from this neighborhood. He told himself kids left unattended, no sense of responsibility from the adults. He reached for his radio, his patience wearing thin. "If you won't tell me where your parents are, I'll have to take you to the station until we figure this out," he threatened, completely oblivious to the fact that his imposing presence and harsh words were overwhelming the little girl. Before Jonathan could make another move, the distant sound of footsteps drew his attention. A small group of neighbors had begun to gather, noticing the commotion. An elderly woman, Mrs. Johnson, hurried across the street, her face etched with concern. "Officer, that's Mia," Mrs. Johnson called out, her voice slightly breathless from rushing over. "Her daddy is just around the corner. She's not alone." Another neighbor, Mr. Thompson, stepped forward, his dog trailing behind him. "Yeah, her father works at the community center. He's probably nearby. She's always playing here." Jonathan's jaw clenched as he faced the growing crowd. His instinct to assert control flared up. He wasn't about to let a group of civilians question his authority. He raised his hand in a dismissive gesture, signaling them to back off. "Step back, folks. This is police business," he barked, his voice sharp. But the tension in the air was palpable. The crowd wasn't backing down so easily. More neighbors had gathered, their expressions filled with concern for the young girl. "She's not in any danger," Mrs. Johnson insisted, her voice wavering with emotion. "Please, officer, just let her be." Jonathan stood firm, his mind clouded by the intensity of the moment. He heard Mrs. Johnson and Mr. Thompson trying to explain, but the words didn't penetrate his focus. His eyes remained locked on Mia, his grip tightening on his radio. In his mind, he was the one in control, the one who knew best in these situations. After all, he had been patrolling this neighborhood for years, dealing with all kinds of trouble. "They always say someone's coming," he thought bitterly. But what if no one does? His sense of responsibility, mixed with an undercurrent of unconscious bias, pushed him to ignore the pleas of the community members. Despite their reassurances that Mia's father was nearby, Jonathan couldn't let go of his belief that the situation needed to be escalated for the child's safety. His jaw clenched and his voice grew harsher as he turned to the crowd. "I told you all to step back. This is police business," he snapped. His hand rested on his belt, an unspoken warning that he wouldn't tolerate further interference. The neighbors, though visibly upset, hesitated. They didn't want things to escalate, especially not with a little girl at the center of it all. But Jonathan was already too far in. His rigid sense of duty, combined with the pressure of proving his authority, clouded his judgment. Ignoring the growing tension, he reached down, pulling Mia closer. The little girl whimpered, her wide, tearful eyes pleading for someone to help her. Without another thought, Jonathan made the decision that would change everything. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs and swiftly locked them around Mia's small wrists. The metallic click echoed loudly in the tense air, a sound that felt wrong even to him. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The neighbors gasped in shock, and Mrs. Johnson let out a horrified cry. "She's just a child," someone yelled from the growing crowd. Mia's sobs broke through the silence, her tiny body trembling as she cried for her father. "Daddy. I want my daddy. Her voice was raw with fear, but Jonathan's training and his internal bias pushed him to ignore the emotional weight of the situation. In his mind, he was doing what was necessary, ensuring the safety of a child in an unsafe neighborhood. Ignoring the mounting outrage from the crowd, Jonathan lifted Mia into the patrol car, her small form dwarfed by the large backseat. Her sobs continued, muffled now by the closed door. As Jonathan climbed into the driver's seat, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. "Let her go," a man from the crowd shouted, but Jonathan was too far gone to hear. His thoughts were already consumed by the next steps, getting her to the station, figuring out what to do next. He turned the key in the ignition, and with a screech of the tires, sped away from the scene, leaving behind a stunned and horrified group of neighbors. When Jonathan pulled into the station, the weight of what had just happened finally began to settle in. The adrenaline that had fueled him during the incident drained away, leaving him with an uneasy feeling. His mind raced as he opened the back door of the patrol car, lifting Mia out, her tears still flowing. Inside the station, Officer Willow looked up from his desk, his brow furrowing as he saw Jonathan carrying the crying child. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice cautious. Jonathan set Mia down, trying to maintain his composure. "Found her alone in the park. No parents in sight," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. "I'm bringing her in for her own safety." Willow's eyes narrowed, glancing at the little girl's tear-streaked face. "Is that really necessary, Jonathan? She's just a kid." His words were laced with doubt, and Jonathan felt the pressure of the situation begin to crush him. Before he could respond, Mia's cries grew louder. "I want my daddy," she wailed, her voice shaking the walls of the station, and for the first time, shaking Jonathan's certainty in his actions. He glanced down at her, then up at Willow, feeling a deep unease settling in his chest. Back at the station, Jonathan paced back and forth, his nerves on edge. Mia's cries echoed through the halls, and Officer Willow watched him with concern. Before Jonathan could respond to Willow's silent judgment, the station door burst open. In strode Ben, his face set in a mask of fury and worry. His eyes scanned the room, locking onto his daughter Mia, who was still shaking and sobbing on the nearby bench. The moment Mia saw him, she cried out, "Daddy," rushing into his arms. Ben knelt down, scooping Mia into a tight embrace, his heart breaking at the sight of her tear-streaked face and trembling frame. For a moment, the station seemed frozen in time. Jonathan, watching the reunion, felt a knot form in his stomach, but his defenses were still up, his sense of authority still at the forefront. "What's the meaning of this?" Ben's voice was low, but the anger in it was unmistakable as he stood and turned to Jonathan. "Why is my daughter handcuffed? Why was she taken away from the park like a criminal?" His words, though restrained, carried a weight that filled the room. The other officers watched in silence, sensing the gravity of the confrontation. Jonathan, trying to regain control of the situation, stepped forward, his voice strained. "I found her alone. No parents in sight. I was acting to protect her." "Protect her?" Ben's voice rose, disbelief and anger flooding his tone. "Is that what you call protection? Handcuffing a 5-year-old girl, traumatizing her in front of our neighbors. You didn't even give anyone a chance to explain." He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone with trembling fingers. "You need to see this." Ben played the video, the footage recorded by one of the neighbors at the park. Jonathan watched in silence as the events played out on the screen, every second unraveling his sense of righteousness. The video showed him towering over Mia, handcuffing her as the crowd pleaded for him to stop. The sight of her tears, her terrified cries, and the mounting outrage of the community were undeniable. Jonathan's stomach churned. He hadn't realized just how out of control things had gotten in the moment. When the video ended, Ben's gaze never wavered from Jonathan's face. "You didn't just overstep. You abused your power. You scared my daughter, and you humiliated me in front of my community." Jonathan swallowed hard, his mouth dry. For the first time, the certainty he had carried throughout the day began to crumble. I was just following protocol," he stammered, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. "Protocol?" Ben's voice was a cold fury. "There was no danger. The only threat my daughter faced was from you." The room was tense, the weight of the confrontation thick in the air. The station's commanding officer entered, having watched the interaction from afar. His face was grim as he stepped forward, cutting through the silence. "Jonathan, you're suspended pending an investigation," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Turn in your badge and your weapon." Jonathan's heart sank, but he knew there was no room to argue now. He had seen the video, felt the undeniable weight of his mistake. With shaking hands, he unclipped his badge, setting it down on the desk, followed by his gun. The sound of metal hitting the desk echoed through the room, final and heavy. The other officers averted their eyes, and Jonathan felt the isolation begin to creep in. The career he had spent over 2 decades building now seemed to hang in the balance, teetering on the edge of collapse. As Jonathan left the station, the storm outside was already brewing. The video from the park had spread like wildfire across social media, and protesters had begun to gather outside the precinct, demanding justice for Mia. Their signs read "No justice, no peace and protect our children, not traumatize them." News vans lined the streets, reporters shouting questions as Jonathan walked past them, his head down in shame. "Officer Jonathan, do you have anything to say about the arrest of a 5-year-old? One reporter yelled, her camera trained on him. "How do you respond to allegations of racial profiling?" Jonathan didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was too consumed with the growing realization of what he had done. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, messages pouring in, some from concerned friends, but most filled with anger and hatred. "You're a disgrace. You shouldn't be allowed to wear the badge." The words stung, but they weren't nearly as painful as the image of Mia's tearful face that now haunted him. As Jonathan drove home, he knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time the weight of his actions settled heavily on his shoulders. After being suspended, Jonathan found himself at home, surrounded by silence that felt deafening. Days passed in a blur of self-reflection and growing guilt. The image of Mia's tear-streaked face, the fear in her eyes, haunted him relentlessly. Jonathan could shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his gut since the moment he watched the video Ben had shown him. For years, Jonathan had prided himself on being a good cop, someone who protected and served the community. But now those beliefs seemed hollow. Sitting on his couch, scrolling through social media, he saw the relentless outrage that had exploded online. The video of Mia's arrest was everywhere, shared, retweeted, commented on by thousands of people, many of them calling for justice, some calling for his resignation. As the messages of anger and disgust flooded in, Jonathan felt a shift within himself. This wasn't just about one mistake. This was about a pattern of behavior, about the biases he had carried with him for years without ever truly acknowledging them. Jonathan's mind flashed back to other incidents, moments where he had let his assumptions guide his actions. He thought of the countless young black men he had stopped over the years, always assuming the worst. The memories piled on top of each other, each one heavy with regret. "Have I been blind all this time?" he muttered to himself, the question echoing in the empty room. With a new sense of determination, Jonathan decided he had to do something, anything, to try and make amends. He began attending community meetings, the same ones he had previously ignored, where members of the black community shared their experiences with the police. At first he sat quietly in the back, just listening. The stories people told were heartbreaking and eye-opening. Mothers talked about the fear they felt every time their children left the house. Fathers spoke of having the talk with their sons about how to behave when stopped by the police. It was hard for Jonathan to hear these stories, but he knew he needed to listen. He needed to understand the pain and fear his actions and the actions of others like him had caused. He stayed after the meetings, talking to people, answering their questions, even when those conversations became uncomfortable. Slowly, he began to realize how deep the wounds ran and how much work it would take to heal them. Not long after attending his first few meetings, Jonathan heard about a local community center that was looking for volunteers to help with after-school programs. He signed up immediately, eager to put his desire for change into action. The first few days were difficult. Many of the kids at the center were wary of him, and some of the parents shot him cold, distrustful looks when they saw his face. He couldn't blame them. He had been part of the system that had caused them so much pain. But as the days turned into weeks, something started to shift. Jonathan threw himself into the work, helping the kids with their homework, playing games with them, and simply being present. He wasn't there to prove anything, he was there to learn, to listen, and to help. Slowly the children began to warm up to him. One afternoon, a young boy who reminded Jonathan Mia asked him for help with a math problem. It was a small moment, but to Jonathan, it felt monumental. Meanwhile, Ben had heard about Jonathan's efforts to make amends. Maria, a close friend and community activist, had mentioned Jonathan's presence at the meetings and his work at the community center, but Ben wasn't sure how to feel. The memory of Mia's arrest was still fresh, the anger and hurt still raw. Every time he thought about forgiving Jonathan, the image of his daughter in handcuffs flashed through his mind, and his resolve hardened. Maria sat with Ben at the community center one evening, discussing the latest efforts to improve relations between the police and the neighborhood. "Ben, he's trying," Maria said softly. "I see it. He's not the same man who arrested Mia. He's learning, changing." Ben sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can forgive him," he admitted. "He hurt my daughter." "How do you forgive something like that?" "You don't have to forgive him," Maria replied. "But maybe you can give him a chance to show he's changed. For Mia and for this community." After much hesitation, Ben finally agreed to meet Jonathan at a small cafe on the edge of town. The atmosphere was thick with tension when they sat down across from each other. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Jonathan cleared his throat, his voice heavy with regret. "Ben," he began, his eyes dropping to the table. "I can't undo what I did to Mia. I can't take away the fear I caused her, or you. But I'm here because I need you to know I'm sorry. Truly, I didn't see it then, but I see it now. I was wrong." Ben studied Jonathan's face, searching for sincerity. After a long silence, he nodded slowly. "I'm not ready to forgive you," Ben said quietly. "But I see that you're trying. That matters." They sat in silence for a while longer, not as enemies, but as two men trying to figure out how to move forward from the mistakes of the past. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. Just as Jonathan began to feel like he was making progress in his efforts to redeem himself, another blow hit. A local journalist published a detailed article about a previous case Jonathan had been involved in years before a wrongful arrest of a black family during a traffic stop. The article stirred up old wounds and reignited the anger that had just begun to settle. Jonathan had thought the case was behind him, but now, with the video of Mia's arrest still fresh in people's minds, it felt like the past had come back to haunt him. The public backlash was swift and brutal. Social media lit up with outrage once again, with many accusing Jonathan of being a repeat offender, someone who had never truly changed. Protest outside the police station grew larger and calls for Jonathan's permanent dismissal reached a fever pitch. The article had reopened a deep mistrust in the community, and Jonathan's efforts to build bridges now seemed futile. At the community center, parents who had started to accept Jonathan's presence began pulling their children away when he approached. He could feel the stares, the coldness in the air whenever he entered the room. It felt like all the progress he had made was slipping through his fingers. That night, Jonathan sat alone in his apartment, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The hateful messages flooded his phone again, each one a reminder of the pain he had caused and the damage that seemed irreversible. He had been trying so hard to make amends, but now it seemed like nothing he did would ever be enough. For the first time since starting his journey toward redemption, Jonathan considered giving up. Maybe the community was right. Maybe he didn't deserve forgiveness. The shame of his past mistakes felt overwhelming, and the isolation from the people he had once served faithfully was suffocating. He stared at the phone, thinking about calling his former colleagues, but then realized they too had distanced themselves. He was truly alone. Alone. While Jonathan was at his lowest, Ben was wrestling with his own thoughts. He had seen the new article about Jonathan's past and felt the familiar surge of anger. But something had changed. Ben had witnessed Jonathan's genuine efforts to change his presence at community meetings, his work with the kids at the center, and the way he had started listening instead of asserting his authority. Ben knew what it looked like when someone was just going through the motions, and Jonathan didn't seem to be that man anymore. One evening, after a long conversation with Maria, Ben made a decision. He knew that holding on to anger wasn't going to heal his community, and more importantly, it wasn't going to help Mia in the long run. If Jonathan was truly trying to change, then Ben believed he should have the chance to do so. The next day, Ben called Jonathan. The phone rang a few times before Jonathan picked up, his voice sounding tired and defeated. "Jonathan, it's Ben," he began. "I've been thinking a lot about what's been happening, and I believe in second chances. I've seen what you've been doing, and I want to help you. We both want the same thing, a better future for our kids and for this community." Jonathan was silent for a moment, stunned by Ben's words. You're willing to help me after everything I've done?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. "Yes," Ben replied, "but only if you're willing to keep doing the work. This won't be easy, and the road ahead is long. But if you're serious about change, then I'm with you." Jonathan felt a surge of hope, something he hadn't felt in days. "Thank you," he whispered, overwhelmed by the unexpected lifeline. With Ben's support, Jonathan returned to the community with renewed determination. It wasn't easy. Many people were still angry, still skeptical of his motives, but Ben's public endorsement carried weight. Slowly, people began to notice Jonathan's consistency. He didn't disappear when things got tough, and he continued showing up to meetings, volunteering at the center, and engaging in difficult conversations about race, policing, and justice. During one community dialogue, an elderly man stood up and addressed Jonathan directly. "I didn't think you could change," he said bluntly. "But I see you here day after day trying. That counts for something." Jonathan nodded, humbled by the words. He knew he still had a long way to go, but each moment like this, each small step toward rebuilding trust felt like progress. As time went on, Jonathan's role in the community shifted. He began speaking at police training seminars, sharing his story of failure and redemption with new recruits. He talked openly about the biases that had clouded his judgment and the harm that unchecked assumptions could cause. He became a powerful advocate for police reform, emphasizing the importance of empathy, accountability, and community engagement in law enforcement. At one seminar, a young officer approached him afterward, her eyes filled with emotion. "Thank you for sharing your story," she said. "I never thought about things from that perspective before. You've given me a lot to think about." Jonathan smiled, knowing that each conversation like this was a step toward real change. With Jonathan and Ben working together, the relationship between the police and the community began to heal. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but over time, trust was rebuilt. The community saw that change was possible not just in Jonathan, but in the way the police department operated. New policies were implemented to address racial bias, and officers were trained to engage with the community in meaningful ways. The once tense atmosphere in the neighborhood began to ease. Neighbors who had once viewed the police with suspicion now saw them as partners in creating a safer, more just community. Children played in the park without fear, and parents felt more comfortable letting them do so, knowing that the police were there to protect, not intimidate. Ben and Jonathan didn't stop at repairing their relationship. They teamed up to create youth programs aimed at fostering positive interactions between young people and law enforcement. They held workshops on understanding bias, conflict resolution, and community leadership, and they invited police officers to participate, not as enforcers of the law, but as mentors and role models. Their initiatives gained attention from other communities facing similar struggles, and soon Ben and Jonathan were traveling to share their model of reconciliation and reform. Mia, too, began to heal from the trauma of her arrest. With her father's support and the newfound sense of safety in her community, she slowly overcame the fear that had haunted her since that day. She returned to playing in the park, laughing with her friends, and interacting with the police officers who now patrolled the area with kindness and respect. One afternoon, as Mia played with her friends, she ran into Officer Rodriguez, a kind officer who had become a familiar face in the neighborhood. "Hi, Officer Rodriguez," she called out, her voice filled with the carefree joy that had once been lost. Rodriguez smiled warmly. "Hey there, Mia. Having fun?" "Yep," she said, running back to her friends without a hint of fear or hesitation. Jonathan's journey of redemption didn't just change the community, it changed him. He found a new purpose in his life, one rooted not in enforcing the law but in fostering understanding, empathy, and growth. His story of transformation inspired others both in his own community and in other cities, struggling with the same issues of racial tension and police mistrust. He continued to work alongside Ben, speaking at events, mentoring young officers, and helping to build a future where policing was about protection and partnership, not fear and domination. On a bright sunny afternoon, Jonathan sat on a bench in the park, watching the community he had once patrolled so differently. Children ran through the grass, their laughter filling the air. Parents chatted, feeling safe and secure in a space that had once been filled with tension. And there, playing with her friends, was Mia, the little girl who had been at the center of his greatest mistake. As Jonathan watched her, a sense of peace settled over him. He had made terrible mistakes, but through hard work, accountability, and the willingness to listen and change, he had found a way to make things right. He knew his journey wasn't over, but he also knew he was no longer the man he had once been. In that moment, Jonathan realized something profound. Change wasn't just possible, it was necessary. And it started with people like him, willing to look inside themselves, confront their own biases, and take the hard steps toward building a better, more just world. As Mia's laughter echoed across the park, Jonathan smiled. This was the power of forgiveness, the strength of community, and the hope of redemption.